Finally, we have the Baroque in part three art stuff when we talk about France and England. There's a ton of stuff here. I'm going to bust through it pretty quickly. You'll miss a lot of the good stories because I just don't want to keep you too much longer than 30 minutes. In France, we like to call the Baroque era sort of the Age of Versailles. Remember that the French don't really get into the Renaissance. They're kind of stuck in the Gothic because they love that style so much. By the time they get to the Baroque era in the 1500s, French have decided to abandon Gothic and come around to this idea of the Baroque, the Renaissance and Baroque styles. Henry IV, Louis XIII, and then finally Louis XIV, who's probably the most important of these three ultimately in our art stuff, build France in such a way that it becomes the most powerful nation in Europe in terms of military. They have great advisors. They invest in the sides of the 30 Years' War that win. That helps them a whole lot. But because of their patronage, because they want great art and they want great buildings, France becomes this huge cultural force during the Baroque era. Truly and honestly, I don't think that their painting is as good as their buildings are. But let's talk about their painting. Their most important painters start with a gentleman by the name of Nicolas Poussin. He is the first French painter to be really a big deal on the international scene. But what you're going to find is true over and over again of all of these French painters is that they learn in Rome. They go to Rome to see what Michelangelo has done, what Titian has done, what all of the great painters, Raphael, etc., have done for painting, and they learn there and bring it back to France. Poussin is one of these. He spent most of his life in Rome. He learned not so much from hanging out with Raphael, but by studying Raphael's work. And then he sees Titian's and he sees all that color coming out of Venice, and he's particularly entranced by that. He really liked a classical style, and that means basically he's not so much about motion, but about bodies frozen in time, sort of frozen in motion. And this picture that you see that I'm going to show you of the abduction of the Sabine women shows you really classical figures. They're sort of muscular. They appear to be more. They're not quite as muscular as Michelangelo, but they have some muscularity to them. But they seem to be kind of frozen in time. And this will make sense when you see it because Poussin actually set this up in little clay figures and then painted from his model that way. So this is the abduction of the Sabine women, and you can see sort of the Sistine Chapel colors in this, but even more bright and vivid. You can certainly see the Sistine Chapel muscularity in this. But those reds and those blues are really more like what Titian would have used in Venetian art. Remember, the abduction of the Sabine women is the story of the Romans going over to their neighboring tribe and stealing all their girls so that they could have families. Along with Poussin, we have Claude Lorraine, and Lorraine is best known for painting landscapes. He painted these beautiful pastoral pieces. This was actually called a pastoral landscape. Basically means that it's kind of a rural landscape. It shows the countryside in sort of an ideal way. You can sort of see the skies that the Dutch are doing at the same time, but a little bit different. But very beautiful pieces. Again, he goes to Rome. He studies Roman art. You can see a little bit of the brushstroke of Leonardo in some of these trees. It's a little bit fuzzier, and that's very typical of Claude Lorraine. Lorraine really does do mostly landscape paintings, or his paintings are mostly landscape, although obviously in this one you have a couple people in the bottom right, you have a city of some sort off in the distance. The third big painter is a guy by the name of Simon Vouet, and he was somebody who rivaled Poussin. Poussin was very, very popular, and Vouet was as well. Again, he went to Rome and learned how to paint, but he comes back to France and he spends most of his time painting in France. He is the court painter. He's appointed the first painter to the king, and probably the most important thing I can tell you about him is that the painting he does and the style that he has is the basis for a movement that happens at the tail end of the Baroque called the Rococo, and we'll talk about that when we get there. Eventually, what Poussin does is more important to France because Jacques-Louis David, who's one of the first artists that we study in AP Art History, copies what Poussin is doing. But this Rococo art is a very interesting little movement that happens at the end of the Baroque era. In this piece, this by Simone Vouet, you have the toilet of Venus. It doesn't mean she's sitting on the toilet. A toilette is basically, you're getting ready for the day, you're cleaning yourself, but you're putting on your makeup and you're dressing and those sorts of things. So here are all these women who are helping Venus um, put on her clothing and get ready for her day. Again, kind of muscular figures. They're a little bit Rubenesque, not too terribly so, but this is very much what Vouet would have done. Look, the buildings that the French do are really fantastic. And so we look at architecture. One of the important dudes is a guy by the name of Mansart. Uh, he does mostly chateaus, and a chateau is sort of a villa out in the countryside. It's not a palace necessarily, although these are very palace-like in some ways. They're big, and only very wealthy people could be able to afford these sorts of things. There's a whole section of the Loire Valley, this river valley of the Loire, where a lot of these are, and they were sort of the country homes of the nobility. And Mansart is responsible for designing a whole lot of these. Um, this I show you this vestibule of the Chateau of Maisons because I want you to look at that sort of design element that's over the door. Well, in Baroque art, you're going to see a lot of extra frippery. I don't know how else to talk about it. In the interiors of building, all of that relief that you've got on there is very typical of the Baroque era. They put in a lot of extra details and decorative sorts of things. But if you see that sort of arch over the doorway that has the cutoff at the top, that's flattened that way. French rooftops start to take on that particular shape as well. You don't see it a lot of other places in the world, but you'll see these black slate roofs that seem to be curved like that, but then cut off at the top. We'll see one a little bit later. These are a couple of the chateaus that Mansart designs. Chenonceau, which is actually on the river, I believe, was, I think, a summer house of one of the queens. Chambord was the summer residence of the King of France. And Chambord is interesting because it is where Leonardo dies. He comes to France at the end of his life. He is working for the King of France at the end of his life. And this is where he dies. If you go to Chambord now, most of these, by the way, during the French Revolution, the revolutionaries basically just stripped them. Today, they are mostly empty. They have, as much as possible, bought some of the furnishings from the time period and furnished some rooms in them so you can visit them. That's how they paid for their upkeep, is simply by tourist dollars. But yeah, they've furnished a few rooms, but a lot of these are just big empty buildings now. You can kind of see in Chambord a little bit of the Disney castle, and that's on purpose. When Disney was looking at ways to design Disneyland and Disney World, he looked at these chateaus as possibilities for how to design different buildings for the Disney properties. The most important of all of these architects, well, of all of these kings really, but architects as well, is Louis XIV. Louis XIV is the final one in the line of those three kings in a row. His grandfather, his father, and he build a lot of things, and they build France up into a world superpower, basically. One of the things that Louis XIV builds is the Louvre, and if you're American, you say Louvre, and there's no RE on it. And of course, if you're really a Rube and you don't know anything about the world, you call it the Louvre, but it's not. It's the Louvre. And if you're American, just say Louvre and call it good. But if you want to swallow that RE, you can do that too. So Louis XIV there hadn't been a new palace for the king in a very long time. The old palace is over by Notre Dame Cathedral, but Louis XIV decides he wants a new palace. You know the Louvre as a museum, but it was not built as a museum. It was built as a palace for the king. And this was, he assigns Colbert as his advisor to oversee all of this building. To build this palace, Colbert decides he's going to call in Bernini from Italy to design it. And Bernini comes to France. I mean, his career in France has kind of been hurt, so he comes to France and he makes these huge plans. But Louis XIV hates everything that Bernini does and rejects them, and instead gives the project to these people: Charles Lebrun, who's actually a painter; Louis Laveau, who's the court architect. That makes some sense. And then this student, Claude Perrault, who is, as far as we know, the one who did most of the work and most of the design. When you look at the Louvre, what you're going to see is that it's designed kind of like a temple, right? There you have the pediment with the sculpture in it. You have all of these columns that are there and walkways. The reason that you know the Louvre as a museum is because during the French Revolution, one of the first things that the Parisian revolutionaries went for was the palace of the king. They went and stripped that. They took it over. But there's all this beautiful art that the king had commissioned over. I mean, over more than one reign, obviously. There's all this cool stuff in there. So the revolutionaries opened up the king's palace so that the people can see his artwork. And lo and behold, eventually it becomes the largest museum of art in the whole world. And it is a monstrous large space, and really cool to go to. I highly recommend it if you go to Paris. In modern times, they've added this pyramid. It was added in the 1990s, I believe. It's designed by an American of Chinese descent by the name of I.M. Pei. He died recently at 101, but he designs this glass pyramid. The problem is these huge crowds that go to the Louvre to see the art. There's no real good way to corral them and get them into the museum, and through tickets and stuff. They had only, this was built as a palace, not as a museum. So Pei designs a courtyard where Mrs. Stessman is standing right there. She's Madame Huscher in this, but where she was standing there, underneath her is an entire huge courtyard underground, where you buy your tickets and you go into the galleries and stuff. But they didn't want it to feel like a cave. They didn't want it to feel like a basement. And so Pei designs this glass pyramid that lets in all kinds of light. It's very beautiful. And the Parisians, of course, hated it like no other, just like they hated the Eiffel Tower when it was built. But they've come to love it, and they should, because it really does do exactly what it was meant to do. It creates an entrance for the Louvre, and it creates light in that big cavernous, I guess, plaza underneath. It's very cool. Here it is from a distance back, so you can see this would have been literally, there would have been a gate across this. This literally would have been the entrance to the Louvre when it was a palace. You would drive your carriage up through this big courtyard that would have been brick at the time, and the pyramid, of course, wouldn't have been there. What you're looking at in the front, this big square thing that looks kind of like a pool, it's not a pool. It's an upside down pyramid. There is water on top of it, but again, it goes down into that courtyard to give it even more light, but it's filtered through the water, so it's kind of this sparkly light that's kind of interesting and cool. The Louvre is cool, but the Louvre does not even touch the Palace of Versailles, which is the coolest of all. Louis XIV had watched his father fight the nobles in Paris. Every summer, the nobles would get the people kind of all stirred up so that they could kind of grab some power from the king, and they'd start all this drama in the summer, especially. And he had watched his father really have to fight against these nobles and what they were doing all the time. And so he decided that rather than play that same game that his father had to deal with all the time, he would build a palace outside of the city in the summertime and then insist that the entire royal court go out to this palace for him, or with him, I guess. And so about 11 miles outside of the center of Paris, his father had a huge estate, and with a little tiny hunting lodge on it. And he decides that's where he's going to build it. It's in a little town called Versailles. And what was once a hunting lodge becomes this huge palace that's just really beautiful, and is one of the best known places in France, and one of the places you really must go see if you go see France at all. It was begun in 1669 by Louis Laveau, but he dies within a year of beginning it. Lebrun then kind of takes over. He doesn't do all the architecturing, but he does kind of decorate it. And the idea is that he is going to glorify Louis XIV. Louis XIV believed that he was descended from the sun god Apollo, right? And so when you go to the Palace of Versailles, you're going to see all kinds of Greek mythology with a special emphasis on Apollo and his story. If you look at this picture, there are a couple things you're looking at really. First of all, the palace itself, if you're looking at this, and I don't know if you can see my little doodah down here, the palace is just this much down in the bottom left-hand corner of the picture. The rest of that is all gardens, because remember, he's taking the entire royal court out to the countryside. He's got to give them things to do. And so he creates they create these huge gardens and all these walkways and all these things where people can go, including, if you look at this, at the far end, at the top, near the top of the the slide, the Grand Canal. It's kind of a big plus sign. It's enough water, it's big enough that they could actually put small versions of naval ships on it, have mock navy battles in the summertime to amuse the nobles, to abuse the nobility while this was happening. There are all these little gardens where they could amuse themselves as well. And there are all kinds of fountains. He spends outrageous amounts of money and does some incredible things to create this palace, including diverting a river so that he could supply water to all of his fountains in the 1600s. It's an amazing place. And on Sunday afternoons in the summertime, they turn on the fountains. The fountains do not run all the time because it takes too much energy and too much water. But on Sundays, the summertime, you can pay to go into the gardens and you can see all these fountains working, and they're just magnificent. In the bottom right hand corner, you get a picture of an actual picture, kind of from a drone that shows you this. I'll show you a larger version in the next slide. So in this slide, you get to see a little bit of the town itself, and you get to see the palace and the entryway. So there would be a gate right here that goes across, and this would have been and that gate is still there, by the way. That would have gated off the palace. All of this is the courtyard into which your carriage would arrive, and then you would dismount right about here. And the main palace is this section here. The apartments of the nobility were over here in this section. This little building right here we'll look at a little bit later is the chapel. It's a Palatine chapel for the king. Over here you have more quarters for the nobility. This complex right here is just the kitchens for this entire complex. You see the formal gardens here, and then out here where there are trees, these are more naturalized gardens. They seem a little less I guess, manicured and such. You can just begin to see the Grand Canal out here. It's a lovely, lovely space. And these gardens go on a lot further than what this picture can show you. This is the interior of the Palatine Chapel. The nobility would have, and especially the king and his family, would have worshipped on the second floor. And the townspeople and the people who worked at the palace themselves were allowed to come in and use the chapel for worship as well, but only on the main floor. They weren't allowed up where the nobility would have been. You're looking at it from the back, from the entry from the back toward the altar in this particular piece. But what you can see in this is all of this, again, amazing art, sort of over the top, very fancy, a lot of detail. There's quite a bit of relief on some of the lower level columns. It's really an incredible place. The Palace of Versailles is probably best known for the Hall of Mirrors, which is in the backside of the palace. The palace is sort of C-shaped, so it would be on the back of the sea, not the arms of the seas. The Palace of the Hall of Mirrors exists. It's a long, narrow hall where they would have held dances. And they had balls nearly every night. They would dance. You have to know that in France, you're going to have weather that's very similar to Kansas. So in the summer, it can get really hot. It's 90 most days. And these people are wearing long dresses, long sleeves. The men are wearing short pants with leggings and big heavy coats that go over them. And they would dance in these, right? We're looking at the late 16, early 1700s. Think about George Washington and the sorts of things he wore. And so it was hot. So what you see here is on your right-hand side, mirrors that are shaped like arches, and they're made up of mirrors that are about 3 feet by 3 feet wide. It was the largest mirror that could be made at the time. Technology that they had would not allow you to make a piece of glass that was more than 3 feet by 3 feet, and then they would silver the backs of them. Apparently, 1 out of every 4 mirrors that they built for this broke on its way there, and it was very, very expensive to make mirrors, and so just this room alone would have cost so much money to build. The mirrors are literally mirrored by, on the other side, those arches that you see on the left hand side of the picture are French doors that go out onto the formal gardens, so they could open all those doors to let in a breeze. People would perfume is invented by the French for the most part. I mean, I guess they don't invent it. I'm sure the Egyptians had perfume. But perfume as sort of an art form is really taken up by the French because because people stank, right? In a world where you don't have deodorant and you're going to dance in the evenings and it's summer, it's going to smell like a barn in there or worse, because human sweat is not very pleasant. People then would perfume a handkerchief, not their bodies. They wouldn't perfume themselves so that they did not stink. They would perfume a handkerchief so that they could hold it near their nose to kind of block the stench of everybody else in the room. People would go all out. Like women would create these huge hairdos that were so big that they could not pass through a door without a special contraption built into their wigs that would pull the wig down so that it wouldn't brush against the top of the doorway. I mean, these people are using money, just like running through money like it's nothing. And building the Hall of Mirrors is one of those things that cost Louis XIV a huge amount of money. It's important, or I guess it's known in history because it's where the Treaty of Versailles is signed to end World War I, that eventually, again, obviously becomes the beginning of World War II because the terms of the treaty were so bad for the Germans. In this picture, you're actually looking out on the back of the Hall of Mirrors, or a part of the back of the Hall of Mirrors, across these big formal gardens where there are these large still ponds. You see there Poseidon, like the Greek mythology that you noted. The gardens are designed by one guy, and you ought to know his name. His name is André Le Nôtre, and he designs all of these gardens, and they are really fantastic. These are the gardens outside of the nobility, of the not of the no, well, of the nobles, not of the king's residence, but of the residence of the other nobles, so that they could go out and wander. Now these are, as I said, formal gardens, and so they would have kept them well trimmed. There were, very defined paths. Nothing was kind of, squirrely and wild looking. It was very, very formal, as it says here, because they wanted the king to be happy. Every 2 weeks they replaced the flowers so that there was always something in bloom in these gardens. It's not like you just threw something in the ground and hope it bloomed all summer. You just changed it all the time so there were always blooms in these gardens for the nobility and especially for the king. This is a picture from a book. That's why there's that crease on the right-hand side of the picture, but it's an important thing to note. As you stand at the top of the formal gardens and you look out toward the Grand Canal, there's a stairway, so you're up above what becomes the formal or the more informal gardens. And this is that view. You're standing at the top of the stairs, looking down out over the Grand Canal, which is pretty far actually. It's a nice little hike for you down there. There are statues lining the way when you get down to that green section that are all Greek gods and goddesses. Before you get to that green space before the Grand Canal, you'll see that there are little trees in boxes. Those are all orange trees. They had something at the Palace of Versailles called an orangery, where they had these orange trees so they could grow oranges year round for the king because he really liked that. So it's like a big greenhouse for oranges. In the summer, they would move these boxes outside so the trees could be outside. But in the wintertime, they went back into the orangery and they were cared for by a particular set of people whose job it was just to be gardeners. You'll notice that there are trees lined up on both sides very formally. If you look at them, especially on the left side, you can see how they are exactly spaced, and that there they are. They're quite interesting. That all of that was engineered to be like that. In front here, you see a big fountain, and I want to talk about this big fountain because it's sort of important. So Leda has twins, Apollo and Artemis. They are the children of Zeus. Zeus has sex with a mortal. He does this all the time, right? And she has twins. Well, Hera, Zeus's wife, is so furious about this that she essentially harasses this woman and her children and the people wherever they tried to settle. She would tell these villages if they tried to live there that they had to kick them out, or she would bring her rage to the village. So these people were always Leda and her children were always being moved from place to place and place. Finally, the mother calls out to Zeus, "How can you let this happen to your children?" This fountain tells the story about what happens when Zeus's wrath comes down on a village. This is that fountain in the summertime at full capacity when it's running, so that you can see what it looks like. But what Zeus does is, because these people are harassing his children and this woman, he turns everybody in the city into water life, mostly into frogs. We were lucky to be there one day in the springtime when they were testing the fountains, and so we have the fountains at not full blast, so you can see the individual pieces. this then is a picture of that fountain without the water going full blast, so you can see the people in mid metamorphosis of turning into frogs in this particular space. Leda and her children are at the top of this fountain, and then around them in rings are all of these people turning into frogs because of Zeus' wrath. At the far end, right before you get to the Grand Canal, there's another great big fountain. This is it. It shows Apollo riding in his chariot to pull the sun up out of the ocean every morning. And that's what this is, the Apollo fountain. It's a huge, huge pool with this huge fountain in the middle, and this is it going in the summertime. I think some of the more dramatic fountains are off in the side wandering places. These are really large fountains and very dramatic. The one on the right, I think, is sort of interesting because look at the people standing there. You can see how far this shoots up into the air, almost like a geyser, and it's very frothy and pretty. And you will see these on a Sunday afternoon. If you go out there, you won't even know they're there, and then suddenly you'll turn a corner and there are these big fountains. They cannot be seen from the palace. You can't enjoy them from there. You don't even know that they're there from the palace. But when you go wandering through these little gardens, there they are that you find, and they're there so that the nobles would have places to go and watch fountains and maybe have a little affair in the afternoon or whatever. This is one that's tucked into the middle of nowhere. Again, you would not see it, but look how big it is. It's called the Baths of Apollo, and it's this huge complex that is all man-made. All of these fountains, there's all kinds of sculpture there. There's a big pond in front, and you would not, it really is a stone's throw from the palace, but you cannot see it from there. By the time we get to Louis XVI, things are changing a bit. We're almost to Louis XVI is the king when the French Revolution happens. He's married to Marie Antoinette, who you know from Let Them Eat Cake. The story is that she asks why the people in Paris are rioting, and she said, and somebody tells her because they don't have any bread, and she says, okay, we'll let them eat cake, as if cake would be cheaper. They couldn't afford to buy bread. She didn't know that. She was busy reading these great philosophers like Rousseau and Voltaire, and she was really taking to heart Rousseau's simplify, simplify, simplify. So she has built on the grounds of this palace. Again, cannot see. This is about a mile away from the palace, but it's still on royal grounds. She has built a little city, a little hamlet, a little village of sorts. Her hameau is what it's called. And she and her ladies in waiting would dress like peasant women, and they would go out and pretend to be shepherdesses. So there was a flock of sheep, and they would pretend that they were herding the sheep. There's a little mill out there. There are big ponds with carp in them. It's very lovely. They would go out and pretend that they were going back to earth and simplifying who they were and going back to their baser nature, kind of like the philosophy says they should. And as an aside, so that you know, that flock of sheep that they had was tended by real shepherds, right? When she wasn't out there doing this. But they perfumed them before the queen came because they didn't want her to have to actually smell livestock. While Bernini was in France, he did a little bit of sculpture. He does a sculpture of Louis XIV on horseback. Louis hated this sculpture, but this is the terracotta version of it before it was actually done in bronze, and it does exist, but Louis XIV did not like it. The French artist who kind of copies Bernini's style, though, and does a really nice bust of Charles Le Brun is Antoine Koisevo, and you can kind of see the Bernini style, all of those curls, all that hair, all that detail on him. In England, the big thing that we're going to see is architecture, and a couple of big architects that we have to know. The first one is Inigo Jones. He creates this banqueting house, which is part of a royal palace, the Whitehall Palace. And there are lots of palaces. You know Buckingham Palace, but there are lots of palaces within London. This is the banqueting hall of the Whitehall Palace. Notice what he's doing here. You can see the swags near the top, near the roof line. That's all relief. And then you see the little flat pediments above those windows. On the bottom level, you have round pediments, lunettes versus like regular pointed triangular pediments over each of those doors. All of this extra detail is just something really. First of all, it's influenced by Palladio, who is a classical architect, and you can see all this extra that's put on these things just to make them look It's just a square building. It's just rectangles and stuff, but he's done things to dress it up and make it look a lot better. The other big building that is built during the Baroque era in London is St. Paul's Cathedral, and this is the mother church of the Anglican Church, and Sir Christopher Wren is the one who builds it. There's a fire in London, and Sir Christopher Wren helps build most of this, helps rebuild most of the city, and his big crowning achievement is St. Paul's Cathedral here. You should see a little bit of St. Peter's in it, right, with that big dome. This has two towers. On the right, you have a clock tower. On the left, you have a bell tower. There's no clock in that little thing because there's a bell in there instead. This is an interesting picture because the bottom half of the building has not been cleaned, so it's black, but the top half of the building has been cleaned, so it's white. This building took a direct hit during World War II with the raids that Hitler did with the Luftwaffe. This is a picture from about the 1960s. So the building would have been rebuilt and cleaned at least once or twice, but it's one of the important places. This is where Charles and Diana got married when they married one another back in the, I think, 80s. Hold on tight, I'm almost done. The Rococo is sort of like Mannerism. It's a little bit of an era tacked to the end of the Baroque, and some would say it's sort of the cause of the Enlightenment. But around 1700, and really in France especially, an art style that appears that is aimed specifically at the aristocrats, the nobility. They didn't want to be distracted by the fact that the people were getting really uppity, and there were lots of problems. Louis the 14th and Louis the 14th especially had overspent the treasury in France to build things like Versailles, and they're having real problems with inflation. They've been at war. There are all kinds of things going on. And they're on the verge of a revolution, and the rest aristocracy doesn't want to think about that. They want to think of nice things like hanging out in the gardens and having little affairs and stuff. And so the art that is there is kind of meant to distract them. It's got a lot of decoration to it, a lot of little extra things, scrolls and ribbons. Everything looks happy. Everybody is happy. The subject matter tends to be frivolous. People are playing, or they are, touching each other or doing things that just create pleasure and little else. And that is sort of what Rococo is doing. I want to show you some interesting pieces by Rococo artists that give you a reason why there's a revolution that happens in France, because these people are so out of touch with reality of the time. First is Jean-Antoine Watteau. He has sort of like Rubenesque figures, but coloration of the Venetians. Watteau does this piece, Return from Cythera, and it's a bunch of very well-dressed nobility sorts of people having a picnic on an island on a day. It's kind of sweet and nice. This piece by Francois Boucher is called Cupid a Captive, and it shows Cupid and these naked women all kind of having a little time out in the garden, touching each other and enjoying each other's sort of bodily pleasures. Again, look at all the little flowers and how it's lit, sort of everybody glows and everybody's happy and nobody has anything that they actually have to do because they're just hanging out and sitting naked in a garden all afternoon. But my favorite of all of these is Jean-Honoré Fragonard, who does The Swing. And you have this beautiful, luxurious landscape. You have a woman in a swing. She's kicked her shoe off. Isn't that nice? Behind her, there is an older man who's pushing her in the swing. And in front of her, there's somebody looking at her while she swings. And that's her lover, who has positioned himself so he can look up her skirts on the swing. Isn't that nice? This old guy has been asked to push her so that the young guy can get a strategic look, so to speak. Notice over on the very far left-hand side, there's a little cherub who's got his finger to his lips. Shh, don't tell anybody we're doing this. And she's really kind of a part of it with her kicking her shoe off. That's sort of symbolic of sexual energy. It's a very interesting piece, but it is probably the most typical of all of the Rococo pieces, all of this extraness and people who don't have anything to do but swing in a garden and play and think about sexual matters. So happens at the end of the Rococo. These people are out of touch, but they're really enjoying their art. Thank you for your attention. That ends the end of the Baroque notes.